Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. We're excited that you've joined us. Our topic today is open source licensing, and really about what's happening today and where it's headed. Very timely topic given all the open source that all of us use. Our webinar today is sponsored by WhiteSource. My name is Mitch Ashley, and I'll serve as your host and moderator. Just a few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, and we will send all participants an email with a link to the recording as well as to a copy of the slides. So sit back and relax. You don't have to worry about taking all those notes. Just jot down a few things and really have a time to listen to our presenter today. Also, stick around to the end because we have 4 gift cards that we're giving away for Amazon gift cards. Our speaker loves questions, and I know our speaker for a number of years, and he's great, wealth of information, loves to answer questions. So please use the GoToWebinar questions tab and enter your questions there anytime during the presentation, and we'll have a Q&A period at the end. So let's move on to our topic, the open source licensing world today and where it's heading. My great pleasure to introduce our fantastic speaker today. It's Matt Asay. He's head of open source strategy and marketing at Amazon Web Services. So let's get things underway. Matt, I'm going to hand the baton to you. Take it away.
Awesome, thank you. I'm always surprised when people have known me for years and they still let me come back. So I appreciate you having me on. And even though I do run open source strategy and marketing for AWS, this isn't going to be an AWS talk. I've been involved with open source for about 20 years now. And over that time have been involved, heavily involved on the legal side. Because in open source, you never really get that far away from the legal side. It's ultimately not a legal phenomenon, but we do spend a fair amount of time talking about software licensing, even though that's usually prefaced with, I am not a lawyer. I am, however, a lawyer, and want to talk about how licenses and business intersect in open source and where we are today and where I think we're going to be going. So without further ado, let's get into it and maybe just briefly talk about who cares about open source. And this seems like the answer is obvious. Everyone cares about open source today. By pretty much any study that you look at, something like 90%, 95% of all enterprises use open source, and the other 5% do, but just don't realize it and answered incorrectly on the survey. Everybody's using open source, and critically, it's at the heart of the most important software that we use today, whether that software is running on premises or whether that software is running in the cloud. So when I say everyone cares, let's get a little bit more specific. Developers care about open source. If you're a developer, you already know why you care. It gives you freedom to experiment. It allows you to explore personal interests. And I recently did a number of interviews of open source maintainers and other contributors to prominent and lesser known open source projects. And every single one of them told me the primary reason that they contribute is not for money, not for fame, it's because they find it fun. And so it's this ability to explore personal interests. Also along the way, and I don't think many developers do it primarily for this reason, but it does help developers build up a personal brand. If you are Jim Bailey and you're the maintainer of the OBS software, then you're probably never going to hurt for jobs. That's not why Jim contributes. That's not why he started OBS, but it's been a nice side benefit of it. Leads to new opportunities, personal development, etc. For a developer, open source is an amazing playground where they get to pull data or pull software that they can use to get stuff done, but it also gives them the ability to build out their personal brand, etc., their identity. Customers care, or let me say it in this way, let me say enterprises care, or organizations, because enterprise can also be government. And why? Because they get amazing software for a relatively low price, can be free, but if you measure it also in terms of the people that go into it, No software is ever really free, but get it for a fantastic price with limited to no lock-in. It's a great way of recruiting developers instead of hoping that somebody answers your LinkedIn ad and that they're a decent developer. You can actually go into their repositories and see what they're contributing, see their pull requests. And it's a fantastic not only way to evaluate potential recruits, but to actually do recruiting. Netflix has done this successfully for years. It's built itself as a place where people can come and innovate in the open, and developers like that. So it's been a great thing. But that heart of it is this great software. And this is where we start to get back into licensing, because it's this amazing software that sometimes may come with strings attached. And what those strings are, that's where we start to get into the thorny issues of open source licensing. But before we jump into that in earnest, let me take one step back and just say, we need more customers or enterprises or government organizations contributing to open source. Jim Whitehurst, who's been a friend for years and was the CEO of Red Hat, now is the president of IBM, fantastic guy. And he said years ago, I think this was 2009, I can't actually see on my screen, but Jim said that we need more users contributing to software. And Matt Wilson, someone that I respect and work with now, he gave a really good reason for it. He says, if you look backwards in time, you'll see that software vendors dominate enterprise software space, and that's why much of the software that we use is so amazingly bad. And the insight that Matt called out to me is that it's not because software vendors are bad at software development, it's because they aren't the ultimate users of that software. And as such, they're not necessarily in the best place to figure out what that software should look like, how it should operate, etc. Now, we can do really good at channeling our inner customer and learning what they want, and then building software accordingly. But the best software done right should come from users. And I say that with a little bit of self-interest in mind. But with this licensing thing and model, it's important to recognize that when AWS started in 2006, it started basically as a place to run open source software. That's what we were doing for Amazon.com and beyond. That's ultimately what the company was about. And we operate software on behalf of our customers. For AWS then, just like customer, where I said, why do customers care about open source? It's much the same thing. Part of it is so that we can serve customers. Part of it is so that we can innovate on behalf of customers. A lot of it is that it just helps us work with and use better software. So thinking about contributions, how do we contribute? Well, one way is simply by operating the software on behalf of customers. So I had this great conversation with Dries Beitert, who's the founder of Drupal. And Dries told me that when Drupal started, they had a significant problem. It was hard to scale Drupal because in part it was hard to scale MySQL. When AWS started, soon after, they got that ability to scale MySQL, and it just made the Drupal community that much easier. The maybe more to when people think of contributions, another way is actually contributing code. And there's a great example recently with Matty Olson, an engineer at AWS, who became one of the maintainers for Redis. And how she became a maintainer is super interesting, at least to me. Historically, Redis didn't support encryption. And with Elasticache, a product of AWS's, AWS tried to make setting up transport layer security, or TLS, in Redis easy, but we had to maintain this functionality ourselves. So there was this discussion internally, well, if we could contribute that upstream and make encryption a built-in part of it, Redis, that'd be good for customers. It would be good for us because we could offload some of that that burden of maintenance from our shoulders and put it back into the community. Salvatore Sanfilippo, the founder and former maintainer of Redis, had been reluctant to implement SSL or TLS into Redis because it introduced complexity, and he really wanted it to be this elegant, compact, simple to use database, or simple to develop database. So when Matty submitted this pull request to introduce a CPU efficient approach to TLS, his first reaction, Salvatore's first reaction was, no, I don't want that. But some of his lieutenants then went and looked at it and figured out a way, wasn't Matty's way, but figured out a way to implement TLS in Redis that preserved that pristine elegance of design and got the encryption baked into Redis. So it was a win-win for both sides. And the result was pull request 6236, which Sanfilippo later described as an SSL patch that was actually a pleasure to read. And so this was this amazing way where this was actually AWS's first, or an AWS engineer's first real foray into contributing to Redis. Importantly, the community, and this is where we're coming back to licensing, the community, and specifically Salvatore, made it relatively easy for Madeline Olson to contribute that, or to submit that pull request. The license around Redis was open. The community bottlenecked a little bit around Salvatore by his own admission. He struggled to really allow a lot of interaction with the code. But it was permeable and it was open, and that's what made it work. Today, after a few years of consistent contributions, mostly smaller contributions actually, but consistent contributions to Redis, Matty was asked to be a maintainer of Redis, along with I think 3 folks from Redis Labs, and my brain's gone blank, but I think another from Tencent, or Alibaba rather. Now, think about that example with respect. The reason it worked is because the licensing was open and the community was open. The benefit to everyone was Redis got better when AWS and others got involved to contribute. And this is the way open source projects should work and do work best. Thinking about the history of software licensing, in 1976, some of you will remember this infamous letter, this open letter to the hobbyists. Today, we rightly laud Bill Gates for all the great things he does with his charity and for world health and other things. It does an amazing amount of good. In 1976, he was just a little annoyed that people were, as he said, ripping off his software. Hobbyists, he called them. He says, you prevent good software from being written. And this, well, it'd be wrong to characterize this as the start of proprietary software. Certainly, Gates shouldn't get any credit or blame for kickstarting proprietary licensing, but it was around this time that this idea that software that hitherto had been mostly open in the academic context, where professors would regularly share their code and the things that they had learned in working with software, it started to close off. And this era of locking up the crown jewels began in earnest. And then we had these large software businesses, and I don't need to name them, you can name them yourselves, get started. Slowly, this gave way as developers started to say, you know what, I don't want to have to get approval from PR or from legal, from purchasing. I just want to get my work done. You want me to build this application? Just let me build the application. Get out of the way. This era of open source licensing began in earnest. And this is when I started to get involved. This was around 99, 2000 era. Red Hat went public in 99, and companies slowly, mostly it started around Linux, but companies slowly started to contribute. Another thing happened at this time, whereas it initially started out as more of a free software movement with GPL, licensing started to open up more and more and became more of a open source software licensing, with the term open source being coined in 1998. And over time, we've seen this trend toward permissive licensing, to the extent that we're almost at a point, and this data is a few years old, but it actually hasn't really gotten any better, or not much better. If you look at GitHub, most of the repositories on GitHub don't have a license. And sometimes that may be just oversight on the developer's part. Sometimes it's intentional, like I want this to be so open that I don't even want a license on it. Well, turns out, at least in the US, there's no such thing as unlicensed software, or software that isn't governed, at least in part, by copyright. The minute you write that software, you have a copyright on it. And so this trend toward permissive, uber permissive licensing with no licensing at all on the software is actually a little bit dangerous, because it could lead people to not understand what their rights are with the software. And even though it sounds great, hey, I can use the software however I want, it doesn't even have a license. That's not actually true. It's not public domain. It does have a copyright, and it introduces complexity into the purchasing and use component, which throughout this time with open source licensing getting permissive, and in the background there's this effort to, hey, the software is super popular, I've got to figure out ways to monetize it, to build businesses around it so that I can make it more sustainable. All good ideas and all good reasons for wanting to work with, to introduce some scarcity, if you will, into the software. What it's resulted in is today a somewhat dysfunctional open source world with all sorts of name calling and punch ups. This is I'm a hardcore Arsenal fan, soccer club or football club in the UK, which is why most of the time I'm depressed, because Arsenal hasn't been good in about 20 years. But that's where we're at today. And I want to go dig in just a little bit deeper into why we're in this situation where we are fighting as much as we're collaborating in open source. Now, in, what was it, 2009? I'm trying to, no, 2005 is when I joined Alfresco. And Alfresco started as open source for content management, and had this model, and we weren't the first to come up with it, but we were one of the first, and we embraced this open core model, whereby you have the core is open, as the name kind of suggests. Oh no. The core is open, and
don't worry, Matt, we don't see your password, you're okay.
No, I'm not worried about that. Sorry about that. I was just trying to get so that I could see the screen in full. The core is open and usually called the community edition, and it's what we normally think of as open source. However, and again, good reasons for this, but there's then a enterprise version, which is basically the core version, open core version, the community version, with a few additional features. Think of it as a light wrapper around, a proprietary wrapper around, so that if you want advanced security, but that's often one, or some additional ability to scale, maybe the community version is you have a certain number of users that you can have per CPU, and enterprise gives you unlimited or something like that. But these artificial constraints were introduced. There are a few problems with it. One is that it made it hard for customers to upgrade in place. So if you have the community version, you think, well, I just flip a switch and suddenly I have the enterprise version. Often didn't work that way, and it introduced friction. I ran sales, North American sales for Alfresco for a few years, and we struggled with this, because when you would get a customer to the point where they said, okay, I'm going to stop using the community version. I want to use the enterprise version. You'd say, great, you need to uninstall community and reinstall enterprise, and then install enterprise. And they say, well, then I mean, I should be evaluating other things at this point because it's a completely new install. And you'd say, unfortunately, yes. And so things have gotten a little bit better in that respect, but not much. And so it was kind of a problem. The bigger problem, I think, is that it set a company against itself. It made marketing your community version, your open source version, you never wanted that to be that great. And you never wanted that to be the thing that every customer chose, because then you wouldn't make any money. So you were put in this position where you had to talk bad about your own product, or just enough to get people to want to buy the enterprise version. It was kind of a problem. And then for engineering teams, there was this constant pressure of, okay, so which features are going to be open, which are going to be closed? And most companies got reasonably good at articulating a clear line of demarcation between community and enterprise. But it just introduced friction into the process. Perhaps for that reason, we've seen some companies like Cloudera in the recent past, and Chef was another one, where they actually went the opposite direction. Instead of closing things down, they opened things up completely. And I suspect part of this has to do with the management that came in from Hortonworks. Rob Bearden, who had had a lot of success with a 100% open source approach, they decided they were going to put on their red hat and use a red hat model. And so far, it looks like it's been very successful for them. They're a public company, and the financial reports have been super positive. Another approach, and this is from a company that I absolutely adore, because I used to work at MongoDB and love the company. After I left, the company introduced what they called the server-side public license. And basically, it was a way of applying the GPL, or applying the requirements of a free software license in the cloud. Now, you could argue that the AGPL, the Affero GPL, already did this, and I would argue that it did, but there were enough reasons for MongoDB and others to think that it wasn't, that the AGPL didn't apply, at least not to the extent that they wanted, not with the certainty that they wanted in the cloud. So it effectively said, you use this software, you got to open source everything that goes into running this software. It was a bit of a nuclear bomb, or a nuclear option. And when it went to the OSI, Open Source International, for approval as an open source license, it got shot down. In large part, there's a provision in the open source definition that says you can't discriminate against particular groups for it to be an open source license. And arguably, this did discriminate against cloud providers for one, but cloud providers and others. And it didn't work. But what did work, and this is I don't want to focus on the negative, because there's no negative here. One thing that MongoDB did is, at the same time, they had this database as a service. And in a conversation that I recently had with Elliot Horowitz, the founder or co-founder of MongoDB, he told me that this cloud service was envisioned from the very start. They just didn't, even though at MongoDB they did raise a fair amount of money, they didn't have the money or the resources from the start to build out a cloud service. Well, eventually they got around to building. This first started with the MongoDB monitoring service, or MMS, which gave way to Atlas, the MongoDB as a service. It's been amazingly successful for the company. I think at the last earnings report, it was 42% of their revenue, and they're now doing about $500 million in revenue, and it just keeps going up every quarter. So the cloud had been perceived as a potential threat to MongoDB, but really it was an opportunity for the company, and it's been great for their customers. Another example of a similar licensing approach was the Commons Clause. Similar just in the sense that it was targeted at cloud vendors, I think. And the idea was that, hey, no, everything's open source. It was a rider that went on the side of the license. It said, everything is just fine, use it, it's open, but you can't sell it. There's only we can sell this software, this Commons Clause licensed software. And again, to an extent, it sounded great because software is open, right? But that rider that attached to it, the Commons Clause, was discriminatory toward a class of user. And you could say in this case, who cares? It's the cloud vendors. They're all terrible. We hate them, and therefore it's a good thing. Well, today it's the cloud vendors. Tomorrow it's somebody else. And that idea of discriminating against a class of user it doesn't abide by the spirit or the letter of the open source definition. So it was shot down, and they ended up, in this case, it was Redis Labs ended up getting rid of it. But here's the thing, again, when you look at Redis Labs, Confluent, DataStax, a number of companies that initially, at least publicly, struggled with the cloud, all of them, to a company, are doing amazingly well with their cloud services. Redis Labs has the Redis Enterprise Cloud, Confluent Cloud, DataStax Enterprise Cloud, I think is what they call it. And you just go, Elastic is another one that's doing fantastic with their cloud business. Confluent recently, I guess not so recently now, but pre-pandemic, raised $250 million, and I think it was a reportedly $4.5 billion valuation. These are companies that were allegedly at risk from the cloud, but as they've built out their own cloud businesses and served customers through cloud, they've just been rocketing. It's been amazing. And so the answer wasn't to introduce licensing that would kill the cloud or kill off cloud providers. The answer was to embrace the cloud, and then their businesses took off. Now, a different thing, and this has nothing to do with any particular class of user, but at the same time, we had the rise of I do no evil licenses, for lack of a better way of saying it. And this is things like the Hippocratic license, which says, derived from the MIT license, intended as amended to limit the impact of the unethical use of open source software. So as an extension of one of open source's most open licenses, MIT, but it introduced requirements that made it not open, that made it effectively closed. Because again, this sounds great. Software may not be used by individuals, corporations, governments, or other groups for systems or activities that actively or knowingly endanger, harm, or otherwise threaten the physical, mental, economic, or general well-being of underprivileged individuals or groups. That is the intention there is fantastic. The application of it is impossible or close to impossible. Even things that you might think and I might think are settled issues, like in terms of which political party or which president is right for the country right now, you think that that's a slam dunk. Whichever side you're on, you think it's a slam dunk argument. I guarantee there's somebody, and maybe about half the country in the US, and wherever you happen to be sitting, pick whatever issue it is, however much you may believe ardently in something, there's somebody on the other side who believes just as ardently that you're wrong. And so these licenses set up to parse what is ethical and what is not, they're hard to implement in practice. And so they've also not done well as in terms of getting OSI approval, because they don't meet the open source definition. Another example, and this one's a little bit easier to establish, is the anti-996 license that requires companies using the software to comply with local or international labor laws. And the idea is to prevent employees from having to abide the common practice in China of working from 9 a.m. until 9 p.m. each day, 6 days a week, so 996. Even here, though, again, the intention is good. The application is hard. Stepping back, thinking about many of these new innovations or introductions in open source licensing, ultimately, like I said, they're not really about open source or about software development per se. They're really about operations. And Tim Bray, who I used to work with here at AWS, he has this great comment where he says, hey, I have so much respect for the people who write this amazing open source software, but I have just as much respect for those who operationalize it. Thinking about those two things as contributions, and how do we enable both of those kinds of contributions with as permissive and open licensing as possible, because both the development of the software and the operating of that software are good for customers. So it's thinking through how do we do that the best. So to talk about that and to address that and to conclude this, let's talk a little bit about pie. I bake a lot, pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, post-pandemic, I make lots of pie. And you might think, I don't like pie. This has nothing to do with open source. Bear with me just for a minute. So here's some pie related math. First, Gartner says open source is 10%, just thinking of the database market, 10% of the roughly $46 billion market. This was 2018, so arguably it's a little bigger today. IT spending, global IT spending is projected to hit 3.9 trillion in 2020. And global cloud spending is thought that it'll top 266 billion. Big number, but look at that 3.9 trillion number. And what that means is when you do the math, and I was an English major, a literature major, so I'm not the best person at math. So somebody else can help me out here, but I'm pretty sure those numbers mean that we're fighting over, in terms of how we are weaponizing open source licenses, or have been over the last few years. We're fighting over 6% of total IT spend, with customers as the primary casualty in this. That is, I don't care who you are, that's a ridiculous percentage to be fighting over when there's 94% of the rest of the market to go out and try to help customers be as successful as possible with open source software, whether running on premises or being managed for you in the cloud. We've got a lot of work to do, and fighting over 6% is really silly. So part of this comes from, and Martin Mikos has been a close friend for years. I love Martin, but he said once, and I think this kind of helped to set the stage for some of this feeling that the pie is limited. He said the relational database market, this was when he was CEO of MySQL, the relational database market is a $9 billion a year market. I want to shrink it to $3 billion and take a third of the market. Look at that Finnish smile on Martin's face as he said that. I can totally, in fact, I think I heard him say that live. The problem is that makes us think that open source is deflationary, and that we're going to end up with a little pie. It's a cute pie. That's my strawberries and cream pie that I like to make, but it's a teeny little pie. And then we do start fighting over it, and we introduce all sorts of licensing gymnastics to fight over it. But instead, I want us to think about Jevon. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that correctly. Jevon's paradox. Simon Wardley, who's likely familiar to many of you, introduced me to this 150-year-old idea of Jevon's paradox. The basic idea is that instead of lower per unit costs leading to a smaller overall market, as people pocket savings, for example, instead we tend to spend the same or more. So when something comes along that lowers prices, instead of us being prudent investors or savers, we spend more. So there are a variety of reasons, including there's a long tail of unmet needs, there's new applications to build, etc. And I saw this while I was at MongoDB. Applications were being built with MongoDB that you simply couldn't before, because it was quite literally impossible to be built with, for example, Oracle. And this wasn't simply because you'd have to mortgage your entire city to afford Oracle. It was just that the document data model was made, it was flexible for developers, and they could build things they couldn't build before at a much lower price. So they built a lot more things. We've seen this not just with MongoDB, but with Redis, with DynamoDB, with all of these different cloud and different open source products that have tended to lower the cost of running software. So at the same time, as I saw there, and as we've all seen from the beginning of the web, open source made web scale applications like Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc. possible. So forget the punitive per unit licensing costs, even just the mechanics of tallying up licenses, they don't work if you have a large scale web application running thousands of servers on thousands of servers. You need the flexibility of open source for that. So Jevon, open source in the cloud, which it helped to create, open source laid the foundation for cloud. It didn't kill the software market. They haven't killed the software market. If anything, they're dramatically expanding opportunities for all of us, whether you're a customer, whether you're a vendor, or whether you, as I would say about AWS, you're both. It's ultimately about making the pie bigger for everyone. The pie isn't shrinking. I wouldn't like that because I like pie. No, it means the pie is getting bigger. It means the future of open source licensing is where we were a decade ago, a shift toward ever more permissive licensing with the operation of software, how companies attract and retain their customers. So this makes it easy to build more. It makes it easy for us to monetize that software and to build more of it. Thank you.
All right, Matt, great presentation. It's good to hear you talk about this subject again. Got a bunch of good questions for you. You talked earlier about not excluding a group of people in the licensing for something to be an open source license or be considered that. Are there any considerations or differences that matter if code's going to be running in a cloud service versus maybe a private environment in terms of open source licensing?
If I understood the question correctly, I think the answer is no. Again, if maybe I say no because I think the ultimate, the best way or the best reason for a company or an individual to contribute back isn't because they have to. It's because it leads to greater benefits for that contributor. So I mentioned Maddie Olson at AWS before and her contributions to Redis and starting with TLS. You could say one approach to that would be to have really restrictive licensing around Redis that would have forced Maddie to contribute TLS. But the better option was to appeal to her self-interest and to AWS's self-interest and have a license that says you don't have to, but oh, by the way, you know that it's going to be better for you as a company and for your customers to contribute this encryption so that you don't have to maintain that software going forward. So I think I mean, I'm a little bit biased in this, but I've been biased on this for like 15 years, which I think is when I switched from Team GPL, which is where I started, to Team Apache BSD. And I just think that the reasons for contributing are rarely, and I don't want to say never, but I will say they never should be because you're forced to. But I think they're rarely because you're forced to, and usually they're because there are other incentives to contribute. And so, with that in mind, I think the kinds of licenses that work on premises and in the cloud really should be the same because the motivations for contributing should be the same.
Yeah, it seems right to me because it doesn't really matter where you run it. You know, if you run it on your watch or you run it in a cloud service or in your data center on your laptop, I haven't encountered anything that has any limitations like that. And the next question is, how should open source companies, probably companies that are following something like the open core model, how should they work with the public cloud vendors? Now that you're in that world, what are ways that help them be as successful as possible working with somebody like an Amazon?
And I want to answer this in a way that isn't just an Amazon response. I
We know you'll
well,
be a little bit.
well, because I know I see from, for example, Confluent is an example of a company that's has worked with AWS for years, even when we maybe publicly have disagreed about some things. Privately for customers on both sides, we've been working the whole time to make the Confluent Cloud and Kafka run as well as possible on AWS. And I know that the same is true for Google Cloud, for Azure. So I think the primary thing is to view the cloud vendors not as they are going to be competitors, period. Whether no matter what face they put on it, it's just the nature of their businesses that they're on one hand they're going to be a competitor, but I think there's a much bigger opportunity to be partners at the code level, partners at the business level in terms of like Google has, I apologize to them, but I don't remember the name of the program, but they introduced this thing maybe a year ago where they had, especially for data and analytics partners, they made it easier to run with Google. It's awesome. And I know Azure, Microsoft has done the same thing with I made brain go blank. Well, they've done it across the board, and Amazon's doing the same thing. So each of these companies, yes, they will compete with you, and then of course in China with Alibaba and others. But there's also a much bigger opportunity to grow the pie together, and that's at the business level of kind of go to market, figuring out how to solve customer issues. Because even though, like, let's say Confluent has this fantastic cloud service, and they do, it's awesome. And they do a lot of the development for Kafka, so they're a good source for that. But there are other things that a customer may want that they're going to find is better with, say, Amazon MSK, which is our managed Kafka service. Yeah, so even though we both offer these Kafka-oriented clouds, depending on the customer and depending on the application, there's going to be different needs. And so working with the cloud providers so that to have a good relationship and to meet those customer needs, whether it's on the open source vendor or the cloud vendor's paper, as it were, I think there's more opportunity to work together. And then at the one thing that I would also say, and I think for obvious reasons, I think companies, the open source companies, have been reluctant to do this until recently. And Redis Labs with this Matty Olson example that I gave has been fantastic to work with. But I think there's been this reticence to allow the cloud providers to contribute to these open source projects, which for me is a mistake, because if you've got a lot of customers running at significant scale, you want that expertise put back into the upstream. You want that learning that happens from serving those customers to go back into the code. And so opening the doors, welcoming, actually encouraging, and in some ways nicely demanding that the cloud vendors contribute back is a good thing. At some times we've had these loud yelling, you need to contribute back, but behind the scenes, there actually hasn't been much, the arms have not been open to contributions, and I think they should be open. We need to view each other more as partners than as competitors, which is, I think, the right way to do things in open source. You're always competing, but you also should be collaborating.
That is sort of you either fully embrace it or around the edges there's some things that you're not sure about contributing. I guess there's an argument to be made that by contributing, that increases adoption, right, for everybody. So
yeah,
as well
by bigger.
We have a question from Jamie. He's asking about resources for people in different roles like lawyer, technical architect, customer, developer, to understand better the nuances of the different open source licenses and how to use them. Any reference information, a website or anything you recommend?
You know, there's a few, and I'll tell you what, today, the resources available to people are so much better than when I got started in earnest in 2000. I'm trying to think of things that if Heather Meeker, if Jamie's an attorney, then there is the, what is it, the PLI. In fact, I'm participating in it. I think it's in September, but there's continuing legal education credits available with a whole thing focused around open source licensing and in the nuances of business around open source. And I would highly recommend that if you Googled PLI, Heather Meeker, Mark Radcliffe, it's going to pop up. But Jamie, if you can see my Twitter handle there, and that's also my email address, either at Amazon or at Gmail. Just send me a note, and there are a few things that with a very short search on my part, I could send you a few good resources to look at.
Excellent, excellent. Next question is from Cesar. I'm saying his name right. Copyright is not the same as a license. It seems to me that you kind of make that same difference. Are they the same thing or are they different?
Sorry, Mitch, I didn't hear the first part of that. Could you repeat it?
The question is, or the statement is, copyright is not the same as a. Can you sort of explain the differences?
Yeah.
Or do you agree with? I should ask first.
No, it's absolutely true. It's not the same as license. My point, and I think this refers back to the statement that I made about this GitHub generation being, in some ways, I think it was James Governor at RedMonk described it as the post-open source generation. And it's, to Cesar's point, it is a little bit mixing apples and oranges because they aren't applying a license. I don't remember the percentage, but let's say 50% are not applying a license to their GitHub repositories, which means that they are not explicitly not under an open source license. And I think the thinking has been that therefore it's kind of a free-for-all. And my point was, but even though there isn't an open source license or other license attached to it, there is always a copyright attached to that code that that person has written or those people have written, and that introduces some complexities to using that software, because just as if it's an open source license, you have to use the software in accordance with that license. If it's not licensed by anything, you still have to abide by the copyright that owner may not be enforcing, may not even know that they have, but they do have it. And so maybe the short way of saying it is, no software is ever truly free of encumbrances of some kind. And in this case, with those GitHub repositories, that encumbrance is a copyright, even if it's not explicitly stated. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think it does. It definitely helps. Next question that we have is from Bora, who's asking about CNCF, Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Can you talk a little bit? I don't think you're affiliated with them, or if you have been, but what are roles of organizations like that in the open source ecosystem?
So I know the CNCF well, and my company is I think a platinum sponsor. So I work with them closely. I think foundations can serve a great role within the industry. They're a great place to have a neutral place for companies, for the most part, to collaborate. And CNCF does a great job of that. Apache, the ASF, Apache Software Foundation, and others, I think, do or can do a great job with that. We've recently seen with Google using the Open Usage Commons, we've seen, I wouldn't say pullback from CNCF or foundations, but just an introduction of a new frankly, a new flavor that's, again, if you're an attorney, suddenly you need to be thinking about, oh, well, what does this mean? Istio and Knative are now under this open usage commons. What does that mean for me? And I am a lawyer, but I'm not a practicing lawyer, so I'm not going to dispense any legal advice. But other than it introduces a new flavor or wrinkle in our open source licensing discussion, and you should, if you're using those projects, you just need to make sure that you're using them in accordance with in the case of open usage commons, in accordance with the trademark policies that apply to those projects. But again, coming back to that question about the CNCF, if you look at things like Kubernetes, Envoy, and other projects under its umbrella, they've been really well served by CNCF. I don't think that means that all software, cloud native software, needs to be under the CNCF. And Google's experimenting with this open usage commons, and I suspect we'll see other experiments over time with companies trying to figure out what's the right way to meet customer needs, to meet developer needs, and to collaborate around the software. And that's good. That's one of the interesting things. I've been in open source for 20 years, and I think maybe I went through a lull of a few years where everything felt the same. And those were the open core years where that was the received wisdom of how you had to do everything. And then we went through a little period where everything had to be in a foundation, and we went through kind of foundation washing. And now it feels like everything's kind of fresh and new, and people are experimenting again. It's an interesting time to be in open source.
Well, speaking of interesting times, since you've been in the industry, since you talked about the early 2000s, you've been through some downturns and some upturns in the economy. Clearly, we're in a kind of tough situation today, maybe getting worse. Well, how has open source played a role in companies either surviving or thriving, accelerating through an economic downturn? And maybe if you can also talk about individuals, whether people start projects or they're contributors to open source. Can open source, that approach, play a role in helping people be part of an economic recovery?
I think so. If you think about it in terms of, certainly in like 2008, I saw that, and I was very grateful. Part of this was the management of the company. John Powell, who was the CEO of Alfresco, where I worked at the time, was really, really wise in how he managed the company. And during that time when it was kind of bleak for a lot of people, for us as a company, things were really good. And the easy answer is, because it's open source, everything's amazing, everything's always amazing. And that's not really true. But I think for customers that are trying to figure out, okay, I'm in straitened circumstances, I need to figure out how to do more with less. I may not want to spend as much money on capital expenditures, but I've got these people and I prefer to keep the people. But people are always the greatest asset that any company has. How can I put my developers to work? Oh, look, I don't remember what the current number of repositories on GitHub is, but there's 1 million at least, I would guess. There's all of this, there's this amazing pool of innovation. Now, granted, some of it's crap, but much of it is, or some of it is really good. There's all this great software that I can use to get more done for less. And if you marry that with the cloud model of operating that software without having to buy all the hardware, et cetera, then suddenly you have software that you can use lower cost, experiment more. If it doesn't work, you spin it down. You didn't spend your mortgage on a database license, coupled with elastic hardware that you can, or infrastructure that you can scale up or scale down. Then suddenly you have all of the right ingredients to figure out, to experiment your way through the downturn and come out on top. I don't want to portray it as this means companies and individuals are not going to have any troubles. It's a difficult time, period. But I think open source does give companies and individuals a lifeline. And if you're an individual, now let's say you did lose your job, if you're a developer, or even if you're not a developer, but you have the means to contribute in some way, whether it's because technical writing, documentation is almost every open source project's Achilles heel and their greatest need. If you can contribute there, or if you can contribute code, it puts you in a stronger position to go out and apply for jobs and to have jobs come to you as people see the work that you're doing. So again, I don't want to sugarcoat it and make it sound like everything's awesome, like I'm Emmett on the Lego movie singing everything is awesome, because it's not. It's a hard time. But open source can make it, or at least it gives us the tools, an essential tool for making things better.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks, Matt. I'm wondering also about sort of the times we're in. There's a lot of discussions about how we bring more people into tech, into software, women in tech, people of color. Do you think open source presents an opportunity to sort of expand the horizon of who's involved in tech and maybe attracting some groups that are underrepresented?
I think it definitely has that. There is that opportunity. This kind of the sad thing about open source historically, and I think it's changing, but one of the sad things about open source historically is that in open source, we've actually done a worse job of pulling in underrepresented individuals or communities. There are signs that that's getting better. When I interviewed Lily Kosic of Red Hat, she's a maintainer on Kubernetes. She talked about how welcoming the Kubernetes community is in particular. And in my interviews with folks, I mentioned Jim Bailey before, but there were a number of others on MuscleLibC, Rich Felker, and a number of others, and all of them said that one of their primary duties as a maintainer is to provide a welcoming atmosphere and community for people to want to join. So I do think it's getting better. And so to your question, I think there is an opportunity for whatever the underrepresented group is. I think there is an opportunity to increasingly get involved. But I would also give the advice, take a look at that community first. You can see their mailing list, you can review the kind of place it is before ever joining, and pick a place that feels like they may want you, because some like the Linux community, and I think to an extent that it may be a little bit overblown, but the Linux community, for example, has historically had kind of a caustic reputation, and for some people, for many people, perhaps that's not going to be what they want their first experience in open source to be. So you can be selective and find a place that's more likely to be a fit for you.
Certainly a lot more options available today than say 10 or 15 years ago in terms of communities, open source. Well, we're coming up on the end of our time. Matt, I was wondering if you might just be able to kind of touch on one other question before we go. Startup companies that begin with an open core model obviously have a lot of freedom of how they shape and build their company. Do you know of any good examples of companies that were proprietary software and made a successful shift to an open source model or partial open source model?
That started 100% proprietary, or that started open core?
I was thinking more on the proprietary side. Is that a shift that companies can make?
So I don't want to say never, but I would say that the mentality is the mental shift is hard. And I think that's why open core was popular for years, because it was kind of felt comfortable to those coming from a proprietary software background, and that was most people that were involved. They had all come from software backgrounds, or most had come from proprietary software backgrounds, and it was just enough of the old world to make the new world bearable, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a hard psychological shift for people to make. I'm not going to say it's impossible. I don't personally know of any examples, but that doesn't mean there aren't examples, and it certainly doesn't mean that somebody couldn't make that shift. I think the easiest way, I actually think, ironically, the easiest way to make that shift might well be to go 100% open. So rather than you got to rip the Band-Aid off and just go all open. And I think the easiest way to do that is to have a cloud service that allows you, because the cloud service is effectively closed because people are just running it as a service. They're not tinkering with the code underneath, and you make the code underneath open source so that the person gets their feeling of proprietary while also being able to contribute 100% of the code as open source. That strikes me as probably the easiest way to do it rather than doing a half measure.
Okay, great. Well, I've let us run just a little bit long, Matt. So thank you so much for a great presentation. And we have a bunch more questions we didn't get to. We'll get those to you, Matt, and hope you can respond to those offline.
Awesome.
Thank you very much for your presentation today.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Let me take care of a few housekeeping items before we drop off. The winners of our gift cards, the Amazon gift cards, the 4 winners are Eugene C, Shane G, Yavin O, and Avilash C. Boy, I got that last name right. So thanks again, Matt AC, excuse me, Matt AC, Head of Open Source Strategy and Marketing at AWS. It's been a great pleasure to be part of the webinar with you, Matt, and with our audience. Thank you for joining us. Your time is really valuable, and we appreciate that you've spent it with us. Be safe, be well, and be careful out there.